his own family members used the tabloid press against him and his wife.
She lied to the Queen, and I watched it happen. Princess Anne's chilling words have just shattered the royal silence. In a stunning revelation that's igniting fury across the Commonwealth, Princess Anne has broken decades of royal restraint to accuse Meghan Markle of directly misleading Queen Elizabeth II. During a private conversation and claims she personally witnessed. With tensions already boiling over and the monarchy fighting to protect its legacy, Anne is drawing a hard line, accusing Meghan of manipulation, betrayal, and tarnishing the Queen's final chapter. What exactly did Meghan say behind closed doors? Why hasn't chosen this moment to speak? And could this be the royal family's final reckoning with Meghan and Harry's narrative? Stay with us. What we uncover next will change everything you thought you knew. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The silence has finally been broken. In a royal household built on quiet endurance, discretion, and centuries of refined image management, very few moments crack the surface. But when they do, the echo can shake the monarchy to its very foundation. This is one of those moments. It began with a phrase, simple, direct, and utterly explosive. Meghan lied to the Queen. I was there. The voice behind those words wasn't a tabloid editor, a royal biographer, or an anonymous courtier. It was Princess Anne, the Queen's only daughter. Known for her no-nonsense attitude and lifetime of loyal, tireless service, and is the least theatrical of the senior royals. She doesn't seek headlines. She avoids interviews. But when she speaks, especially now, the entire institution listens. The statement sent a shockwave across both sides of the Atlantic. Up to this point, Princess Anne had largely avoided getting involved in the noisy, messy fallout between Prince Harry, Meghan Markle, and the rest of the royal family. But something changed. And that change led to what insiders are calling the most direct and personal royal rebuke since the Duke and Duchess of Sussex walked away from the firm. This is not a story of petty jealousy. It's not about media rivalry or who got the bigger Netflix deal. This is about legacy, about a daughter defending the memory and honor of a mother who ruled longer than any monarch in British history. And it's about a confrontation that began in hushed palace corridors but is now exploding into public view with all the force of an institutional reckoning. We begin at the heart of the storm, a private conversation that allegedly took place between Meghan Markle and Queen Elizabeth II in the final months of the monarch's life. A conversation that, until now, was thought to be routine, maybe even affectionate. But according to Princess Anne, it was anything but. She says she was present when Meghan gave assurances to the Queen that turned out to be false. And not just false in hindsight, but knowingly deceptive at the time they were spoken. Anne's words are cutting, not theatrical. "You don't dishonor my mother's legacy and walk away unchallenged," she reportedly told a close confidant. That quote has now made its way through trusted journalists and royal circles, and it speaks to a deeper fury than any public statement ever could. Because for Anne, this isn't just a matter of personal disdain. It's a betrayal of everything the monarchy was built to protect. To understand the gravity of this moment, we must first understand Anne. Unlike her brothers, she was never in line for the throne. Unlike Meghan, she never attempted to use her platform to launch a brand, star in documentaries, or redefine the royal role. Her work has always been quieter, more consistent, and fiercely private. She doesn't chase headlines, she endures them, and grew up in the formidable shadow of her mother but never resented it. She admired Queen Elizabeth's stoicism, her sense of duty, and her unflinching loyalty to crown and country. That loyalty shaped Anne's worldview. To her, service wasn't a choice, it was an identity. And to see that identity being used, twisted, and, in Anne's view, exploited by Meghan Markle was too much to bear. The friction between Meghan and Princess Anne has long been rumored, whispered behind palace walls, buried in coded tabloid language about tensions and differences in approach. But now we see just how deep the resentment ran. Anne's statement lifts the veil and reveals a battle that was never about personalities but about principles. According to sources close to the situation, the moment in question took place during one of Meghan's final visits to Buckingham Palace before the infamous Megxit announcement. At the time, Meghan was still officially a working royal, though behind the scenes, the wheels of departure were already in motion. That day, Anne claims Meghan spoke with the Queen about her commitment to remaining half in, half out, stating that she and Harry still intended to represent the crown while pursuing independent ventures abroad. But, and says she knew better. She had seen the contracts. She had heard whispers from staff. She understood the real plan. Total separation from the monarchy, followed by a global media blitz. The Oprah interview, the Netflix deal, the Spotify contract, all of it was already in progress. And believes Meghan misled the Queen intentionally, giving her mother false peace of mind in what would be some of her final months. This wasn't just a matter of broken protocol. It was a deeply personal offense. Not just against the Queen's office, but against her trust. The Queen, who had weathered wars, scandals, divorces, and public revolts, rarely showed emotion in public. But in private, those close to her say she was becoming more vulnerable. And Meghan, and insists, exploited that vulnerability. The world remembers Queen Elizabeth as a figure of steel and grace. But those closest to her in her final years remember something else, a quiet sadness, a deepening fatigue, and a desire to leave the monarchy in stronger hands than she found it. And was one of the few who truly understood the weight her mother carried, and who now feels that Meghan undermined that weight in pursuit of her own global platform. And statement, then, wasn't made in the heat of gossip. It was a calculated decision, years in the making. And it speaks volumes about how seriously she takes her mother's legacy. "I was there," she said, "not just physically in the room, but emotionally, historically, and ideologically." She stood for everything the Queen represented. And she will not allow that legacy to be rewritten by what she calls a campaign of selective storytelling and self-promotion. What's more, this moment isn't just about past events. It's about what comes next. Because Anne's words are more than just criticism, they are a challenge, a gauntlet thrown, in saying what she said, and has opened a door that many thought would remain permanently closed. A senior royal publicly questioning the integrity of Meghan Markle, not through veiled statements or strategic leaks, but through direct confrontation. And now, the world is watching. Will Meghan respond? Will Harry defend her or remain silent? Will King Charles support his sister's version of events, or attempt to pull the family back into a unified front? Will the public side with Anne's unfiltered truth or Meghan's media-savvy framing? This is no longer a tabloid skirmish. It's a defining clash between two versions of royal life, one rooted in generational duty and quiet sacrifice, the other in modern identity and global influence. And standing at the center is a woman who rarely speaks, but who has now spoken loud enough to shake the gates of Buckingham Palace. Anne's words weren't just meant for Meghan. They were meant for the public, for the monarchy, for history. In one sentence, she's drawn a line in the sand and dared anyone, duchess or not, to cross it. As this story unfolds, one truth is clear. The royal family may survive scandal after scandal, but it cannot survive the erosion of trust from within. And if Anne is right, if Meghan truly did mislead the Queen in her final days, then this is more than a feud. It's a reckoning. Buckingham Palace had always been a place of formality and controlled rhythm. From the carefully timed routines of state duties to the subtleties of palace interactions, everything functioned like a well-oiled machine steeped in centuries of tradition. But something changed in the final years of Queen Elizabeth's reign. Underneath the polished surface, behind the smiles at garden parties and ceremonial photos, a quiet unease had started to grow, one that would eventually explode into full-blown division. The entry of Meghan Markle into the royal fold didn't just disrupt the public image of the monarchy, it disturbed its very internal balance. From the moment Meghan walked into the palace for the first time, the tension was there. Not openly hostile, not aggressive, yet unmistakably present. Staff members spoke of a shift in tone, a cautiousness in how conversations were approached. It wasn't that Meghan was rude. It was that she was unpredictable. For a palace built on continuity, where behavior was rehearsed and responses scripted through generations of etiquette, Meghan's spontaneity and emotional openness were jarring. Princess Anne sensed it immediately. She had seen countless royal marriages and newcomers enter the family, but none like this. Meghan, Anne believed, had no interest in learning the culture, she came to change it. And that was the beginning of the private war no one could see. And didn't voice her concerns publicly, nor did she stage any dramatic scenes. That wasn't her way. But she observed. She watched. And she remembered. During this early period, aides who had served the Queen for decades found themselves caught between two realities. On one hand, they were told to treat Meghan with the same deference afforded to other senior royals. On the other, they were quietly instructed to make allowances for her being new to the system. Those conflicting orders created confusion, which in turn bred resentment. And in the royal household, where staff loyalty is often stronger than familial bonds, resentment doesn't just fade, it accumulates. The Queen, ever the diplomat, tried to bridge the gaps. She invited Meghan to private lunches, offered gentle advice, and made sincere efforts to welcome her into the fabric of royal life. At one point, sources say, Elizabeth even privately told Meghan that she reminded her of a younger Princess Margaret, independent, confident, and unafraid of the spotlight. But where Margaret was born into the constraints of royalty, Meghan had walked in by choice. And that, as Anne would later explain, made all the difference. One staff member who worked closely with both women at the time described the dynamic succinctly. The Queen was trying to knit the family together, and was trying to keep it from unraveling. Meghan didn't seem interested in either. As months passed, friction turned into fatigue. Whispered disagreements between Meghan and senior courtiers began surfacing in the press. Articles appeared with phrases like "sources close to the palace" and "insiders allege," always vague but damning. Accusations ranged from Meghan being difficult with staff to ignoring royal advice. Each time, Harry and Meghan's team pushed back, blaming the media or the institution itself. But behind palace walls, the damage was already being done. It was during this period of mounting tension that Anne truly began to distance herself from Meghan. According to those familiar with the royal calendar, Anne skipped several key events where Meghan would be present, citing other engagements or personal obligations. But for those who understood the unspoken language of royal behavior, the message was unmistakable. Anne wasn't just disapproving, she was isolating herself. One former equerry revealed that Anne had a saying she often repeated when discussing new royal spouses: "You don't join the family to be noticed. You join to serve." He said she never named Meghan directly, but the implication was always there. The wider family tried to keep things neutral. Charles, caught between his son and his sister, attempted diplomacy. William maintained public silence. But inside their private homes at Balmoral, Sandringham, Windsor, the conversations were different. They weren't about race, modernity, or media manipulation. They were about conduct, trust, and whether Meghan and Harry were planning their exit long before they officially made it public. Then came the breaking point. Reports surfaced that Meghan had reduced a senior aide to tears. The palace didn't deny it. In fact, they confirmed they would look into staff allegations. It was an unprecedented move, one that couldn't have happened without at least silent approval from high-ranking royals. Many believe and was among those who insisted the matter not be swept under the rug. This wasn't just about palace gossip. To Anne, it was about respect for the monarchy, for the staff, and for the Queen. As the investigation simmered, the internal divisions widened. Meghan and Harry began making plans to step back. And, according to sources, was among the first to predict the move. She reportedly told her aides, "They're already gone in their minds. It's only a matter of when." Those close to her say she was less angry than disappointed. She had hoped Meghan might mature into the role, that Harry might recenter himself. But by that point, she believed the die had been cast. Then came the Sandringham Summit, where the Queen, Charles, William, and Harry met to negotiate the Sussexes' departure. And was not part of the core discussion, but her presence nearby was felt. Staff say she met privately with the Queen that same afternoon. No one knows what was said. But what followed was the announcement that Meghan and Harry would no longer use their HRH titles and would not represent the Queen in any official capacity. It was a firm, final line, and many believe Anne's voice helped draw it. In the months following the split, Anne withdrew further. She continued her royal duties with precision, appearing at agricultural shows, naval bases, and hospitals. But behind the scenes, she was watching the fallout. The Oprah interview, the allegations of racism, the claims that palace staff were complicit in Meghan's suffering. All of it fueled her internal rage. But still, she remained silent. Until now. When Anne finally spoke the words, Meghan lied to the Queen. "I was there." She wasn't just recounting a moment. She was revisiting the entire context, the lies, the manipulation, the performance. She didn't care about being politically correct. She didn't need media applause. She wanted the truth on record. And that truth began in a palace gripped by quiet tension, eroded by calculated moves, and ultimately fractured by betrayal. This was the setting. This was the beginning of the storm. When Meghan Markle first stepped into the world of British royalty, there was a moment, brief but powerful, when it seemed as though the monarchy had found the fresh start it desperately needed. An American actress marrying a beloved prince, a biracial woman bringing a modern face to an ancient institution, a love story promising a bridge between tradition and transformation. The fairy tale narrative caught fire instantly, and for a time, the House of Windsor leaned into the momentum. Newspapers beamed with photos of her radiant smile. Television segments hailed her as the next Princess Diana, only sharper, savvier, and better positioned to thrive in the modern age. Behind palace doors, however, that optimism was paired with nervous curiosity. Meghan wasn't just another royal bride. She was a celebrity, a divorcee, and a woman with her own media presence before ever wearing a royal title. She had walked red carpets, negotiated contracts, and made her own money. More significantly, she had a sense of self, polished, brand-aware, and unapologetically American, that clashed with the monarchy's ethos of silent duty. To some members of the family, including Princess Anne, that difference wasn't merely a cultural adjustment. It was a warning sign, and had seen this pattern before. She had watched the press fall in love with fresh royal faces. First Diana, then Fergie, and later even Kate Middleton. But she had also seen the damage when public perception diverged from royal reality. She knew the difference between a working royal and a media darling. The two roles rarely coexisted for long. Still, the institution tried. The Queen welcomed Meghan with a genuine effort to include her. She broke subtle protocol by inviting Meghan to royal engagements before her wedding, something rarely done with fiancés. In public, the monarch was warm. In private, she offered advice and guidance. Meghan, for her part, appeared eager to please, at least initially. She curtsied perfectly, wore hats at the appropriate tilt, and smiled through public ceremonies with grace. The press called her a breath of fresh air, and, however, remained reserved. From Anne's perspective, charm wasn't proof of loyalty. She watched how Meghan interacted with staff. She paid attention to how quickly Meghan moved from listening and learning to suggesting and reshaping. Within months, palace aides reported that Meghan wanted to overhaul royal communications, insisted on input into event planning, and resisted long-established protocols. Her intentions may have been modern and progressive, but her execution struck many, especially Anne, as arrogant, and reportedly told a close staffer, "She doesn't understand the difference between being important and being royal. They're not the same." That wasn't jealousy speaking, it was observation, and had been born into royalty, raised by the Queen herself, and had spent her entire life mastering the invisible art of duty, how to show up, blend in, and do the work without seeking applause. Meghan, by contrast, brought cameras wherever she went. As her public profile grew, so did her influence within palace circles. Harry was utterly devoted. Courtiers who used to brief Prince Charles and Prince William found themselves navigating Meghan's preferences instead. Invitations to events were adjusted based on her schedule. Social media posts were rewritten to better reflect her voice. Even internal staff reshuffles were quietly made to accommodate the Sussex household's unique demands. Meghan was rising, and not everyone was thrilled. To be fair, not all of the discontent was rooted in tradition. Some of it came from fear that Meghan would eclipse the rest of the royal family, fear that she would expose the cracks in the institution, or that her celebrity status would fundamentally redefine what it meant to be royal in the 21st century. And for the older generation, Princess, and especially, those fears were not abstract. They were grounded in memory.
And remembered the Diana years. She remembered how the media turned a vulnerable young woman into an icon and then tore her apart when she stopped playing along. She remembered the damage to the monarchy's image, the desperation behind palace spin campaigns, the late-night strategy sessions to keep up with tabloid hysteria. And now, as she watched Meghan climb higher in public opinion, she braced for the pattern to repeat. The turning point came during the royal tour of Australia, New Zealand, Tonga, and Fiji. Meghan was pregnant with Archie, and the tour was a massive success. Crowds turned out in the thousands. The headlines were glowing. And within days, Meghan and Harry's team announced the pregnancy to the public, seizing a moment of high visibility to make the news even bigger. Behind the scenes, however, royal aides were seething. The announcement had bypassed normal procedure. Senior royals were informed only minutes before the public. Anne, according to insiders, found the move opportunistic and deeply inappropriate. The tour had been carefully crafted as a diplomatic mission. Meghan and Harry's decision to make it about their personal news, and felt, cheapened its purpose. She didn't say this to the press, of course. She never would. But those who worked with her said she made her feelings known in private meetings and internal reviews. Over time, Anne's resistance turned into quiet withdrawal. She stopped attending events where Meghan would dominate attention. She limited her comments in family meetings. She kept her interactions civil but cold. One staffer described the atmosphere between them as professional but frosty, like colleagues forced to share a boardroom with two very different visions of success. Meanwhile, Meghan's rise continued. She launched charitable initiatives, guest-edited Vogue, and began crafting the Sussex brand as one rooted in social justice and digital storytelling. The Queen's courtiers struggled to keep up. The press couldn't get enough. But Anne wasn't buying it. She saw the glitz, the speeches, the carefully curated interviews, and she saw a woman building a personal empire on the back of the crown. There was one moment that seemed to crystallize everything for Anne. It happened during the launch of the Queen's Commonwealth Trust event, where Meghan spoke passionately about gender equality. The audience applauded. The media swooned. But Anne sat still. Later, she reportedly told an aide, "Don't mistake passion for protocol. There's a reason we don't all give TED Talks every time we speak." To Anne, the role of a royal wasn't to be a motivational speaker or a lifestyle guru. It was to show up, serve quietly, and leave the moment bigger than yourself, not the other way around. By this stage, Meghan's place in the court was secure on the surface but strained beneath. She had built a following. She had allies. But she also had critics. Many of them internal. Anne's voice was one of the sharpest, though it remained largely behind the scenes. That is, until Meghan and Harry dropped their bombshell announcement, they were stepping back from royal duties, moving abroad, and carving out a progressive new role. Anne's response, according to sources, was unfiltered. "I saw this coming the day she walked through those gates." For Anne, Meghan's rise wasn't a success story. It was a carefully executed campaign. And the royal court, as she knew it, had been the stage. Now, the consequences of that rise were unfolding in real time. The monarchy was under fire. The Queen's health was declining. Harry was estranged. And Meghan was preparing for the next chapter of her global career. But Anne was done staying silent. She had watched Meghan climb. She had watched her pivot, maneuver, and ascend. Now she was watching her rewrite the narrative. And she was no longer willing to let that happen without a challenge. There are few phrases more powerful in royal discourse than the words, "I was there." In a world where so much is shrouded in secrecy, wrapped in protocol, and buffered by press offices and polished statements, those three words cut through everything. They remove speculation. They shatter doubt. They offer direct, undeniable presence in the very room where history was quietly made. So when Princess Anne said, "Meghan lied to the Queen. I was there," she didn't just offer an opinion. She dropped an undeniable piece of testimony. One that could alter the legacy of an already fractured royal era. What was the lie? That question has now been debated across headlines, newsrooms, palace corridors, and dinner tables from London to Los Angeles. What could Meghan Markle have said to Queen Elizabeth II that was so fundamentally dishonest it not only triggered Anne's rage, but prompted her to finally break her silence years later? According to multiple royal sources who have remained close to the matter, the moment occurred in late 2019 during a private audience between the Queen and the Sussexes, an audience that was meant to calm the rising storm, but instead, Anne claims, sowed the final seeds of betrayal. At the time, tension had been building for months. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex had completed their successful Africa tour, announced Meghan's pregnancy, and were simultaneously navigating mounting media pressure. Tabloid headlines had grown more invasive. Leaks from both sides, Pallas and Sussex, had escalated the feud. And behind the scenes, Meghan and Harry were already in quiet negotiations for a more independent path. They didn't want out of the family. Not entirely. But they wanted out of the system. The rigid expectations. The relentless public scrutiny. The lack of personal control. They were preparing to reshape what being royal meant. And they believed they had a moral and strategic right to do so. Queen Elizabeth, aware of the increasing fracture, called for a quiet meeting. Just the three of them. No staff. No media. No interference. She wanted clarity, not conflict. According to insiders, she sat Meghan and Harry down in her private sitting room, just off her study in Windsor Castle. She asked for honesty. She wanted to know their intentions. Would they remain committed to the duties they had accepted? Would they work with the palace to create a balanced path forward? Or were they, as some aides suspected, already committed to stepping away? This was Meghan's moment. She could have said everything was uncertain. That she and Harry needed time. That they were overwhelmed but still devoted to the Queen's vision. Instead, and says, she gave assurances. Firm, specific, and insists, deliberately false. She told the Queen they had no plans to leave, and would later recount in a closed conversation with palace officials. She said they only wanted flexibility, not separation. That they were still committed to the crown. And sat a few feet away as the words were spoken. She says she watched the Queen's shoulders relax with relief, her eyes soften with hope. Meghan knew what to say, and believes. She understood the Queen's longing for unity and spoke directly to it. But and says she also knew, at that very moment, that media agents were being contacted, contracts were being considered, and a plan was already in motion to announce their departure after the new year. To Anne, that wasn't diplomacy. It was deceit. She later told a close advisor, it was like watching someone smile while placing a dagger on the table. My mother believed her. I didn't. And I'll never forgive that. Those who know and say she's not a woman given to dramatics or exaggeration. Her anger doesn't burn fast, it builds, calculated and enduring. She left the room that day with a bitter certainty that Meghan had used her charm to neutralize the Queen's concerns long enough to make their exit seamless and strategically favorable. That belief was reinforced just weeks later when Harry and Meghan dropped their shocking statement on Instagram. They were stepping back from their senior roles, dividing time between the UK and North America, and working to become financially independent. The Queen was blindsided. Palace aides scrambled. The press descended. And Princess Anne was furious, not at the decision, but at the manipulation. I was there, she repeated privately to members of her team in the days following the announcement. She lied to the Queen's face. Kindly. Gracefully. But it was a lie all the same. Anne's version of the event has since gained traction among those in the palace who felt the Queen was made to look weak, unprepared, and misinformed. Her Majesty, ever the professional, issued a carefully worded response expressing sadness and support. But those behind the scenes knew better. They saw it in her eyes during that next morning's briefing. The sense of betrayal. The disbelief that her trust had been so easily taken advantage of. What makes Anne's accusation so extraordinary isn't just its content, it's the rare choice to voice it publicly, even in indirect terms. Throughout her life, Anne has maintained a strict policy of discretion. She doesn't speak out. She doesn't feed scandal. She lets her work speak for itself. But this time was different. This time, she believed silence would equal complicity. And it wasn't just about Meghan and Harry's departure. It was about how they did it. About the deliberate, strategic packaging of the Queen's trust as a launchpad for a global brand. Anne believes Meghan's charm and media savvy were used as tools, not to protect the institution, but to eclipse it. And for Anne, that isn't just offensive, it's unforgivable. In a rare behind-the-scenes briefing, a senior aide close to Princess Anne explained, she doesn't hate Meghan for leaving. She hates that she used the Queen's grace to grease the wheels of her exit. If they had just left honestly, there wouldn't be this fury. But Anne sees it as betrayal wrapped in politeness. And that, to her, is worse than outright rebellion. The ramifications of that moment are still unfolding. Meghan and Harry's brand has grown stronger. Their media projects, from podcasts to documentaries, continue to reach global audiences. But so has the divide within the family. And Princess Anne's declaration, "I was there," now looms like a shadow over every interview, every memoir excerpt, every charitable event the Sussexes front. Because when a royal says they witnessed deception firsthand, it changes everything. It forces the public to reconsider not just the headlines but the entire narrative. And when that royal is Princess Anne, a woman known for her restraint, her work ethic, and her uncompromising loyalty to the crown, the accusation carries more weight than any tabloid ever could. Anne has not elaborated further. She hasn't written a memoir, staged a press tour, or issued a formal statement. She doesn't need to. Her words, 6 of them, are enough to stir global debate. They suggest not just disagreement but betrayal. Not misunderstanding, but premeditated manipulation. And in the world of royalty, where perception is legacy, such words may echo louder and longer than anything Meghan and Harry have yet to say. The truth, when it finally surfaces in royal affairs, often arrives in fragments. Rarely does it come in a neatly packaged confession. In the case of Princess Anne's accusation that Meghan Markle lied to Queen Elizabeth II, the clarity lies not just in Anne's recollection of the moment, but in the layered complexity of what the alleged lie truly represented. This wasn't a simple misstatement or a misunderstanding. According to Anne and those within her inner circle, it was a calculated misrepresentation with far-reaching consequences, both personal and institutional. At the core of the controversy was a question that had haunted the palace for months: was Meghan ever sincere in her intent to serve as a working royal, or was she always planning to leave? For Anne, the answer was clear. She believed Meghan had made up her mind long before the public ever suspected. And the so-called lie to the Queen wasn't just about whether she would stay or go, it was about intent, trust, and manipulating the monarch's final years to serve her own interests. According to multiple insiders with knowledge of the Windsor conversations, the alleged lie revolved around Meghan's assurances that she and Harry wanted to remain part of the royal family, only with more freedom. She expressed to the Queen a desire for a new model of royal duty. What would later be dubbed the half-in, half-out arrangement. It would allow the Sussexes to continue representing the monarchy on certain official matters, while also pursuing private income through speeches, production deals, and brand partnerships. Meghan, by Anne's account, presented the idea as a modern evolution of royal service, one that could help the monarchy stay relevant in a changing world. She framed it as a compromise, not an ultimatum. And Queen Elizabeth, ever the pragmatist, agreed to explore the option. But Anne says that Meghan left out a crucial detail: she had already signed, or was in the process of negotiating, deals that would conflict with royal neutrality. Netflix, Spotify, speaking engagements worth millions. All of it, Anne believed, was underway behind the scenes, even as Meghan smiled sweetly and told the Queen they were still figuring things out. To Anne, that omission was the lie. It wasn't just that Meghan had failed to mention certain projects. It was that she had packaged herself as committed to the Queen's vision while laying the groundwork for a separate, branded identity that could only exist once she had cut formal ties. That deception, Anne believed, wasn't merely strategic, it was predatory. It preyed on the Queen's decency, her desire for family harmony, and her trust in Meghan's supposed commitment. Anne wasn't the only one who sensed something was off. Members of the Queen's staff reportedly flagged inconsistencies in the Sussexes' private planning. Meetings that were supposed to be exploratory were followed by press leaks and trademark filings. Conversations about philanthropy were paired with whispers of scripted interviews and production pitches. Every signal pointed to a departure, but Meghan's words to the Queen painted a picture of continuity. One royal aide put it bluntly, it's one thing to negotiate an exit. It's another to build a brand while pretending you're still negotiating. That's what Anne saw. And what Anne saw was not just a moment of dishonesty, but a pattern of manipulation that would soon play out on the world stage. The eventual launch of Archewell, Meghan and Harry's non-profit/media hub, was built on language strikingly similar to what Meghan had told the Queen, about empowerment, service, compassion, and social impact. But missing from the branding was any reference to the crown. The imagery, the tone, the voice, it was distinctly separate from royal life. And when their first Netflix documentary aired, featuring raw interviews and pointed critiques of the royal family, it became unmistakably clear to Anne and others, the split had always been planned. What stung most for Anne wasn't the financial independence, nor even the move to California. It was the feeling that Meghan had used her mother as a stepping stone. That she had wrapped her exit strategy in flowery, respectful words while quietly chiseling a separate identity out of the royal foundation. And saw in Meghan's actions a kind of opportunism she found abhorrent. She had seen celebrities. She had met politicians. She had dealt with ambitious women from every corner of the globe. But none, in Anne's view, had ever smiled so warmly while pursuing something so calculated. There's also a deeper layer of betrayal and reportedly felt, one rooted not in politics or media, but in the emotional weight of monarchy itself. Queen Elizabeth, in her final years, had begun to loosen the grip she held on her legacy. She delegated more. She spent more time at Windsor than Buckingham. And she made it clear to those closest to her that family unity mattered above all. Meghan's words, her assurances that she still believed in royal service, meant something to the Queen in that context. She wanted to believe them. And Anne knew that. She gave my mother comfort, and is reported to have said to a senior official. And then she tore it away. That's not just a lie. That's cruelty. For a family that has endured scandals, divorces, abdications, and media takedowns, the Meghan saga was different. It wasn't just public. It was personal. And didn't just see a royal duty broken, she saw her mother's trust violated. That's what triggered the statement. That's why Anne, known for decades of silence and stoicism, finally chose to speak. Some have argued that Anne is being too harsh. That Meghan and Harry were under immense pressure, vilified by the press, and fighting for their mental health. That they didn't owe the institution transparency about every contract or conversation they were having. But Anne would argue back, if you're using the crown to build your name, you owe it everything. Not just loyalty, but honesty. Especially to the woman who gave you that opportunity in the first place. And perhaps that's where the heart of this accusation lies. Not in a single conversation or a missed disclosure. But in the chasm between what Meghan said and what she did. The promises to serve, followed by the documentaries tearing down royal traditions. The curated image of devotion, followed by the reveal-all memoirs. The suggestion of unity, followed by complete detachment. That's the lie, Anne says. A lie told with grace and executed with precision. As the world continues to digest Anne's statement, many are beginning to see this moment as more than an isolated grievance. It's becoming a litmus test. A challenge to the story Meghan has built and sold. It asks the public to consider whether charm can mask strategy, whether sincerity can coexist with ambition, and whether silence from the monarchy means peace, or betrayal. The Queen may no longer be here to defend herself. But her daughter is. And Anne, ever the loyal sentinel, has chosen not just to remember, but to speak. Because sometimes, protecting a legacy means naming the betrayal that others are too polite, or too afraid, to say aloud. The image the world held of Queen Elizabeth II. Stoic, composed, eternally unflustered, wasn't just a public persona. It was deeply real, and those closest to her often spoke of her unwavering calm in moments when the institution around her threatened to unravel. Yet, behind the poise, there were rare, intimate glimpses of vulnerability. And according to those who served her in her final years, the aftermath of Meghan and Harry's departure, particularly the moment when Princess Anne alleged that Meghan misled the Queen, was one of those instances when that vulnerability quietly emerged. When Meghan sat before the Queen in late 2019 and offered what Anne would later describe as a knowingly false assurance, the Queen took it at face value. Those in the room say Her Majesty didn't question the sincerity. She trusted the words. For a monarch who had seen 11 prime ministers come and go, survived global conflict, and led the nation through both triumph and turmoil, Elizabeth II still operated on a simple principle in private. Trust people until they give you a reason not to. At that meeting, when Meghan expressed her commitment to the monarchy, promising that she and Harry weren't walking away, merely adjusting the model, Queen Elizabeth reportedly nodded with restrained optimism. She may have been old, but she wasn't blind to change. She understood the monarchy needed to evolve, and in Meghan, she had hope. What she didn't know was that outside those palace gates, legal teams were preparing contracts, media outlets were being briefed, and a full-scale exit strategy was unfolding behind the scenes. When the official announcement finally came on January 8, 2020, and Meghan and Harry declared to the world their intent to step back as senior members of the royal family, the Queen, for once, was caught unprepared. It was one of the very few times, insiders say, that she felt blindsided. The news was released on social media, without formal approval or coordination with Buckingham Palace. Senior staff scrambled to respond. Meetings were called. Phones rang through the night. But amid the chaos, the Queen's own reaction was telling. Those in her private circle say she sat in silence for several minutes, reading the statement over and over. Her face, typically unreadable, gave way to something that could only be described as weary disbelief. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't weep. But she asked the same question 3 times, why didn't they tell me this before? It wasn't said with anger. It was said with disappointment. A sense of being misled not just as queen, but as a grandmother. Princess Anne, who had not been informed of the Sussexes' announcement in advance either, was reportedly nearby. A senior official who witnessed their conversation later remarked that Anne's expression was stone-cold. She simply looked at the Queen and said, "I told you." The Queen didn't reply. But from that day forward, her demeanor toward the situation shifted. No more hopeful negotiations. No more accommodations for a hybrid role. The Queen moved swiftly to protect the institution. She convened a summit at Sandringham with Charles, William, and Harry, where the terms of Meghan and Harry's exit were laid out. They would no longer represent the Queen. They would forfeit their HRH titles in practice. They would repay funds used to renovate their home, Frogmore Cottage. The message was clear: this wasn't a flexible departure, it was a complete break. But even as she took these actions, those closest to her say the Queen carried a private sadness. Not just over the departure of her grandson, but over the realization that she may have misjudged someone she had sincerely tried to welcome. She had allowed Meghan into her inner circle far faster than she had with any royal newcomer in recent memory. From private train journeys to shared appearances, Elizabeth had extended a generosity that Anne later felt was weaponized against her. In private moments at Windsor, the Queen reportedly reflected on the situation not in terms of policy, but in terms of family. "I only wanted them to be happy here," she once told a close friend. "I thought we were giving them space to thrive." That belief, that the Crown could offer both duty and personal fulfillment, was one the Queen had held for decades. But in the wake of the Sussexes' decision, that belief seemed to erode. And according to palace aides, Princess Anne saw that erosion as a direct consequence of Meghan's actions. And reportedly became more present during this time, not in a showy way, but in quiet support. She joined the Queen for more lunches. She sat in on more briefings. She became, in the words of one official, a silent shield. Not because she needed to be told what to do, but because she instinctively knew her mother was hurt. In the months following the departure, the Queen rarely mentioned Meghan or Harry by name. She referred to them as the young ones or our California branch. When asked how she felt, she would usually respond with a smile and a diplomatic, "Families have their ups and downs." But those who read between the lines could see the difference. The warmth was gone. The Queen, while still supportive in public, was emotionally retreating from the entire saga. The Oprah interview in 2021 further deepened that retreat. Meghan's claims of institutional racism, abandonment, and cruelty were met with shock across the palace. And while the Queen's official response, recollections may vary, was widely praised for its calm neutrality, privately, the Queen was shaken. She had believed Meghan when she promised to serve. She had believed in Harry's ability to balance love and duty. Now she saw both narratives reframed as prison walls. Anne, according to those close to her, was livid. But she didn't push her mother for an emotional reaction. Instead, she provided something else, presence. She traveled more. She appeared at more events. She filled in when Charles or William were unavailable. She became, without ceremony, the anchor her mother needed. One of the Queen's oldest confidants later recalled, and knew her mother didn't need comfort. She needed resolve. And gave her that. In her final year, Queen Elizabeth rarely spoke publicly about the Sussexes. But those close to her say she remained quietly proud of the institution she had spent a lifetime protecting. And while she never voiced regret for how she handled Meghan and Harry's entry into the family, there was a sadness in her silence. A sense that she had tried to build a bridge, and had been met with an exit strategy. When Anne finally broke her own silence, declaring that Meghan had lied to the Queen and that she had witnessed it firsthand, she did so not to reopen wounds, but to correct the narrative. And believed that the public had been sold a fantasy, that Meghan had built a story around being mistreated, ignored, and forced out, when in reality, she had been embraced, empowered, and ultimately walked away on her own terms. And most importantly, Anne believed that the Queen's generosity had been used as a tool, then discarded. The Queen is no longer here to defend herself. But her daughter remains. And Anne, with her deliberate words and unwavering loyalty, has chosen to ensure that her mother's final chapter isn't rewritten by those who came and left. To the public, Princess Anne and Meghan Markle rarely appeared in the same space. Photographs of the two women standing side by side are minimal, interactions nearly non-existent. But those who worked inside the royal family's inner circle knew better. Their paths crossed often enough, and when they did, the room could feel like it was holding its breath. The clash between Anne and Meghan wasn't explosive in the traditional sense. There were no screaming matches, no slammed doors, no leaked recordings. But tension has many languages, and both women spoke fluently in their own. Anne, with her biting silence and curt expressions. Meghan, with her carefully crafted warmth and unmistakable presence. What occurred between them was not loud, it was cold, sharp, and deeply personal. Anne had her suspicions from the very beginning. She watched Meghan with the trained eye of a lifelong courtier, someone who had grown up measuring character not by what someone said in public, but by how they treated the people who didn't matter. From palace attendants to low-ranking aides, and paid attention to how Meghan navigated the hierarchy. And what she saw troubled her. And valued consistency, discretion, humility. Meghan, on the other hand, was confident, outspoken, and always camera-ready. And saw Meghan's flair as disruptive, not because of what it represented externally, but because of what it disrespected internally. Meghan's arrival shifted the temperature in the palace. Staff began speaking in whispers. Protocols were suddenly questioned. And while some of the younger royals and aides welcomed the breath of fresh air, and did not. She viewed it as a draft that would open doors better left shut. Behind closed doors, the atmosphere was often icy. One aide who worked during that time described staff meetings where Meghan's team would propose new directions, more direct media engagement, increased online branding, or modern wardrobe shifts, and Anne's staff would quietly roll their eyes or shake their heads. Nothing needed to be said. The cultural gap was clear. Anne's world was grounded in loyalty and hierarchy. Meghan's was steeped in autonomy and self-reinvention. There were moments when the tension surfaced in subtle but cutting exchanges. At a private luncheon attended by several senior royals, Meghan reportedly brought up her desire to begin her own charitable initiative, independently branded and structured outside of the existing royal foundations. According to sources present, Anne raised an eyebrow and asked flatly, "And how would that work under the sovereign grant?" A simple question, but one that sliced straight through the glossy idea. Meghan reportedly smiled and replied, "We're looking at new models." And didn't respond. She didn't need to. That lunch marked a turning point. From then on, Anne distanced herself further. She declined joint engagements where Meghan was present. She reduced her interactions in family meetings. She became, in the words of one royal biographer, an invisible wall Meghan couldn't pass. But the true collision came during a pre-scheduled strategy meeting at Kensington Palace. It was meant to be a routine session, briefings for upcoming tours, discussions about overlapping patronages, and coordinated messaging. Meghan arrived with her staff, prepared and polished. And was already seated, flipping through her notes with a mechanical precision that made clear she'd rather be anywhere else. When the topic turned to joint initiatives, particularly, the possibility of Meghan partnering with Commonwealth youth organizations under a shared banner with Anne, the mood quickly changed. Meghan expressed enthusiasm, noting her passion for women's rights and youth leadership. She spoke about her experience working in gender advocacy in the UN, and how she believed the monarchy could be more directly aligned with global human rights conversations. And cut her off. "We already do that," she said, without looking up. There was a pause. "I mean a more modern approach," Meghan offered, trying again. "Something more digital. More global-facing." And finally looked at her. "The Crown isn't a startup, Duchess," she said quietly. "It doesn't pivot. No raised voices. No insults." But the silence afterward was thunderous. One senior advisor later remarked, "You could have heard a pin drop." It wasn't just disagreement. It was dismissal. And wasn't trying to humiliate Meghan. But she wasn't going to indulge her either. To Anne, the suggestion that the monarchy needed rebranding was insulting. It implied that the centuries of sacrifice, of quiet service, were outdated. When in fact, they were the very foundation that kept the institution standing. For Meghan, that exchange was pivotal. She left the meeting frustrated and, according to one staffer, emotionally drained. She confided to Harry that she felt unsupported, even targeted. She began speaking more openly to her team about the toxicity of palace culture, the resistance to new ideas, and what she called the silent saboteurs within the family. Though she didn't name names, those closest to the matter knew exactly who she meant. The divide became unbridgeable. Anne, for her part, didn't gossip. She didn't leak. She didn't retaliate. But she also didn't forget. And when she later heard Meghan speak publicly, about the lack of support, the isolation, the suggestion that certain royals had refused to help, she took it personally. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. Because the story being told to the world was missing context. Missing accountability. Missing honesty. One aide close to and recalled her watching part of the Oprah interview in silence. When asked what she thought, she reportedly replied, "It's a performance. A very polished one. But a performance all the same." That was the moment and began considering whether it was time to speak. The Queen was still alive then. And out of respect, and remained silent. But the internal rift grew. And after the Queen passed, Anne felt an obligation, not just to correct the public narrative, but to protect her mother's legacy. Meghan, in Anne's view, had not simply clashed with palace culture. She had manipulated it, then publicly condemned it when it no longer served her. And believed that silence had allowed a lie to grow. And she was done staying silent. By the time Queen Elizabeth II neared the end of her life, she had already witnessed the rise and fall of entire eras. From wartime Britain to the digital age, from colonial holdings to post-imperial evolution, her reign was nothing short of monumental. Her resilience, quiet grace, and commitment to duty became the cornerstone of modern monarchy. But even the longest-reigning monarch was not immune to the bitter forces that tore at the foundation of her legacy in the twilight of her reign. And for Princess Anne, that threat came not from a foreign adversary, political instability, or constitutional crisis, but from within the royal household itself. To Anne, the risk was not simply that Meghan and Harry left. Royals had abdicated before. Members of the family had stepped down, divorced, disgraced themselves, and faded into obscurity. The monarchy had weathered it all. The real danger, in Anne's eyes, was that Meghan didn't just walk away, she took the Queen's moral authority with her and repackaged it into something entirely different. That transformation, Anne believed, was insidious, calculated, and corrosive. What Anne saw happening was the slow redefinition of public memory. Meghan and Harry, through carefully choreographed media engagements, began to shape a new version of history, one in which the Queen's kindness was overshadowed by the narrative of institutional cruelty. In which private conversations were interpreted as coded attacks. In which the monarchy itself became a symbol of inherited oppression, rather than inherited responsibility. And found it unbearable. In the royal family, legacy is not a choice, it is a burden carried forward generation after generation. Queen Elizabeth had spent her life trying to preserve that legacy, not for herself, but for the future of the nation. Her dedication was not theatrical. She never sought to be adored. But she demanded that the crown remain respected. That it be seen as something greater than the sum of its flawed parts. And now, as Anne saw it, that very essence was being rewritten through interviews, documentaries, podcast monologues, and memoirs, each one adding another layer of doubt to the Queen's final years. It was a quiet undoing. Meghan's public persona was crafted with skill. The carefully styled appearances. The vulnerable revelations. The socially charged language of empowerment and trauma. She cast herself as the outsider who had been silenced, misunderstood, and rejected by an ancient system unwilling to adapt. Harry, willingly or blindly, amplified that message. Together, they didn't just tell their story, they reframed the monarchy as the antagonist. And could not allow that version of events to harden into historical fact. She viewed it as a direct assault on her mother's memory. And that assault was all the more offensive because, to Anne's knowledge, it was grounded in selective half-truths and omissions. The Queen, she insisted, had gone to extraordinary lengths to welcome Meghan. She had personally invited her to private engagements. She had gifted her opportunities no other royal spouse had received so early in their entry to the family. She had extended grace where many in the household might have offered only formality. To Anne, that grace was now being exploited. The Queen had kept her word. She had promised to support Meghan and Harry's early transition and had done so with dignity, even after the abrupt announcement of their exit. But what came next, the televised grievances, the global headlines questioning the Queen's moral compass, the accusations of racism lodged without names, was, in Anne's mind, a betrayal of the deepest order. What made it even more painful was how the public, especially outside the UK, reacted. In many parts of the world, Meghan's version of events was taken as truth. The idea that the monarchy was a relic of prejudice found new footing. And in that cultural shift, Queen Elizabeth's legacy was being reinterpreted. No longer was she simply seen as the dutiful monarch who weathered every storm. Now she was being recast as the silent enabler of a broken institution. And watched in silence for as long as she could. But her silence did not equate to agreement. She understood that history, once rewritten, rarely gets corrected. And if the Queen's memory was to endure with the honor she believed it deserved, someone would need to speak. Someone who had been there. Someone who had lived every contradiction from the inside. The danger to the Queen's legacy wasn't just reputational. It was structural. The monarchy survives because it commands a certain mythos. It isn't democratic, but it is expected to be benevolent. It isn't political, but it must remain relevant. The Queen's quiet authority over 7 decades had managed to preserve that fragile balance. But in her final years, that authority was being pulled apart. Meghan's global reach. Her ability to shape discourse, to bend perception, to inject activism into monarchy-adjacent identity, was reshaping how younger generations viewed the institution. For many, especially those outside the UK, Meghan was seen as the future. The Queen. A figure of the past. And found this unacceptable. Because the crown, in her eyes, was not a brand to be managed or a platform to be reshaped. It was a trust passed down through blood and sacrifice. And her mother had honored that trust without fail. Anne, who never chased cameras or sought popular praise, now found herself thrust into a role she never asked for, the protector of a legacy under assault. The late Queen had once said, "I have to be seen to be believed." She understood that presence mattered. But and now feared that absence, Elizabeth's death, was allowing belief to be twisted. That without the Queen alive to embody her values, others would define them as hollow. That Meghan's media power, left unchecked, would erode the public understanding of what the Queen actually stood for: service without complaint, duty over comfort, tradition as a form of continuity, not oppression. The Queen never replied to the accusations hurled in interviews. She responded with silence and subtle statements. Recollections may vary, she had said in the face of public condemnation. It was her way, measured, civil, restrained. But now, Anne was not bound by the same constraint. The Queen was gone. And Anne believed the silence had lasted long enough. The Queen's legacy, in Anne's hands, would not be defended with elegance and ambiguity. It would be defended with facts, memories, and direct refutation of what she believed were false narratives. Not out of spite. Not out of vengeance. But out of necessity. In private, Anne began speaking more openly. Not to the press. Not in memoirs. But to trusted figures within the palace, among government liaisons, and eventually to selected historians and authors who were beginning to compile the definitive accounts of the Queen's reign. In those conversations, Anne drew a line. She made it clear that the crown may have evolved, but it had not abandoned its values. And that any attempt to recast the Queen as indifferent or complicit in Meghan's alleged suffering was not only wrong, it was insulting. And new public opinion could not be controlled. She wasn't trying to win a popularity contest. But she was determined that when history books were written, they would not base their judgments on sensational interviews and cleverly edited documentaries. They would contain the truth, not a fantasy born out of resentment and rebranding. Anne's loyalty to her mother had always been private. But now, faced with the erosion of that mother's legacy, she understood that duty had taken on a new form. And for the first time in her public life, Anne made the choice to intervene, not for herself, not even for the monarchy, but for the memory of a woman she had watched serve a nation with unparalleled dignity. The Queen was gone. But Anne was still here. And she would not let her mother be rewritten. When the audio recording first emerged, revealing Camilla's scathing remark about her health and her supposed manipulation of public sympathy, Catherine, Princess of Wales, said nothing. Not to the press. Not to the staff. Not even to her own family outside the palace. Her response, or more accurately, her lack of one, was neither avoidance nor passivity. It was a deliberate decision. And in a world dominated by reaction, spin, and rapid-fire rebuttals, her silence was deafening. Kate had never been the kind of royal to engage in tit-for-tat conflicts. She didn't do interviews unless absolutely necessary. She rarely offered personal opinions in public, and she carefully avoided any appearance of palace infighting. So when the leaked audio began making the rounds in media circles and her name was once again pulled into a whirlwind of speculation, many anticipated a response, perhaps through a palace spokesperson, perhaps through an anonymous insider close to the princess. But none came. What the public didn't see was what happened behind closed doors. When Prince William approached her with the news and played the audio, it was a moment he dreaded. For him, this wasn't about palace optics, it was about protecting his wife. He knew how hard she'd fought to stay strong amid her health challenges. He'd seen her push through exhaustion, nausea, and days of intense physical discomfort just to smile in front of flashing cameras or wave politely at public events. And he knew how fragile the boundary was between dignity and devastation when someone she tried to respect crossed such a personal line. Kate reportedly listened to the audio only once. She didn't react immediately. There were no tears. No gasp of disbelief. When it ended, she closed her eyes for a moment, then handed the phone back to William and said, simply, "I see." That was all. A few minutes later, she turned her attention back to her notes. She had been reviewing early education plans for a new initiative linked to one of her patronages. To her staff, it appeared as if she was unaffected. But they knew better. They had seen her in private moments, knew the quiet signals of emotional pain she never allowed to show on her face during public appearances. The tightening of her jaw. The brief flicker of her eyes. The longer-than-normal pause before speaking. She felt it. She just refused to show it. Those closest to her say Kate made one thing absolutely clear: there would be no statement, no counterattack, no attempt to leak her side of the story. "This isn't about her," she said. "It's about what we stand for." That philosophy, grace under fire, has been Kate's guiding compass for years. But in this case, it took on a deeper meaning. She knew that any public acknowledgement of the comment would elevate the drama. It would deepen the division between her and Camilla, forcing the public to take sides and undermining the image of royal unity. But more importantly, she knew it would hurt William. The more visible the rift became, the more pressure it would place on him. Both as a son and as a future monarch. So she chose silence not because she was afraid or unwilling to defend herself, but because she understood that her power didn't come from speaking. It came from restraint. And that restraint didn't go unnoticed. In the days following the leak, public sentiment rallied around Kate in a wave of support rarely seen for any public figure in modern Britain. Polling data showed that her favorability ratings surged. Newspaper editorials praised her poise, calling her a living embodiment of strength and dignity. Social media lit up with hashtags like #StandWithKate and #GraceUnderFire. People shared personal stories of their own battles with illness and how Kate's composure gave them courage. But the most telling responses came from within the palace itself. Princess Anne, known for her no-nonsense approach to royal duty, was reportedly deeply impressed by Kate's silence. In a private message passed through aides, she said, "You didn't have to speak. The world saw everything." Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, who shares a close personal relationship with Kate, visited her privately the day after the tape made headlines. They spent nearly 2 hours in the royal gardens, walking slowly and talking softly. No one knows exactly what was said, but Kate returned from that walk visibly calmer. Even Queen Elizabeth's former lady-in-waiting, now retired but still closely connected to the royal household, was said to have remarked, "Her Majesty would have been proud." She believed in silence as a weapon. Kate's children, thankfully, were largely shielded from the scandal. George, at 13, was beginning to become more aware of media narratives, but both parents ensured that the children were kept insulated from the noise. Family routines continued as normally as possible: school runs, homework, evening dinners. Kate made it a point not to let the situation disrupt their stability. But behind the scenes, she and William became more tightly bonded than ever before. Those close to the couple described their shared silence as not just emotional solidarity, but a deliberate strategy. They understood that this moment, like so many in their royal lives, was not just about personal feelings. It was about precedent. About setting a tone. If they responded with bitterness or retaliation, they would be opening the door to endless cycles of leaks, counter-leaks, and royal mudslinging. By refusing to engage, they preserved their moral high ground, and their public credibility. In William's eyes, Kate's silence only confirmed what he already knew: she was the best of them. "I won't forget this," he reportedly told her during one of their private dinners the following week. "You've carried so much, and you still carry it better than anyone." Meanwhile, Camilla remained notably absent from public view. She cancelled several scheduled engagements, citing stress and a need for rest. While no official statement was made, royal watchers couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between the two women, one retreating into silence, the other standing tall in it. Kate continued her public duties where health permitted. She made a surprise appearance at a children's hospice opening in early July, wearing a modest pale blue dress and offering hugs to terminally ill patients and their families. No press questions were allowed. No remarks were made about the recent controversy. But the message was clear: Kate was not hiding. She didn't need to speak to make her point. In many ways, her silence said more than 1,000 statements could have. It said she refused to be dragged into pettiness. That she would not dignify cruelty with a response. That she would continue to serve, continue to lead, and continue to rise above. And the public followed her lead. Even those with little affection for the monarchy acknowledged her grace. Journalists and columnists from both liberal and conservative publications praised her handling of the situation. Women's advocacy groups issued open letters commending her for showing that strength doesn't always look like confrontation, that sometimes, the most powerful act is restraint. In the modern age, where scandals spread in seconds and reputations rise and fall with each tweet, Kate's response was not just rare, it was revolutionary. She did nothing. And in doing so, she won everything. Of all the relationships that fractured during the storm surrounding Meghan Markle's entry into the royal family, perhaps none was more painful for Princess Anne than the slow unraveling of her connection with her nephew, Prince Harry. Once the playful boy trailing behind Diana's heels, later the mischief-making soldier with a heart of gold, Harry had grown into a man and had genuinely liked, if not deeply respected. He wasn't burdened with the same expectations as William, but he wore the weight of being the spare with surprising grace in his early years. He was warm, relatable, and, above all else, loyal. At least, he used to be. Anne's disillusionment didn't begin with Meghan. It began with the slow, subtle shift in Harry's behavior that coincided with their relationship. At first, she assumed it was natural. Love changes people. It refocuses priorities. But Anne noticed something deeper: Harry wasn't just changing his life, he was changing his story. The boy who once adored his grandmother was now echoing critiques of the institution. The young man who once joked about getting on with it during difficult public engagements now seemed resentful of his obligations. And the Harry who had once considered an extension of his mother's protective family circle now treated her as a stranger. And had always seen Harry as more emotionally vulnerable than his brother. William was calculated, methodical, shaped early by the knowledge that he would one day be king. Harry was freer, but also more impulsive, more reactive. And believed that if Harry had married someone who embraced the monarchy, even if critically, he would have stayed the course. But Meghan, as Anne saw it, was not merely skeptical of royal life, she rejected it outright. And in that rejection, she pulled Harry along. There are those in the palace who say Harry was never truly happy within the confines of royal duty. That his struggle with the press, his unresolved grief over Diana's death, and his discomfort with the media's treatment of his relationships all left deep scars. But Anne believed those challenges, while real, had been manageable, until someone came along who encouraged him to turn that pain into a crusade. That person, in Anne's view, was Meghan. The accusation that Harry was a puppet in Meghan's narrative is not one and made lightly. She never voiced it to the public, but behind closed doors, she questioned his autonomy. Not because she thought he was weak, but because she feared he was deeply in love and too wounded to see the consequences of his decisions. Her concern wasn't just about Harry's departure from royal duties, it was about his apparent willingness to dismantle everything.